friends and neighbors. Welcome in the light, where laughter's the answer and hearts are shining bright. With calloused hands and wits, so raise your sharp. Let's praise a place where love ignites the spark.
Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to Sunnyside. Well, there is a particular kind of comfort that we take in stories about the past. I have a degree in history, and I enjoy history. I haven't always enjoyed reading history or biographies, although I have to admit the largest section of my library are in those two categories, and then religion as well. So I guess you got to read a lot of boring nonfiction to be a person who likes history. The best stories that I found, the best versions of the histories that I read had a narrative quality to it that I could appreciate. And critics of those type of people like, critics of Stephen Ambrose, for example, they would say that they're pop culture historians. And maybe they are. I don't know. But I can tell you this. I watch, I don't always read. I watch streaming services, probably just like you do. And recently I watched the Netflix series, I think it's 7 episodes, of the House of Guinness. I was interested because, as you know, I've been to Ireland. I went to Ireland this late summer, and I toured around and had a great time. Got a chance to make a good friend in Brendan McCarty and be with my family. And we have Irish roots and all of that stuff. So I thought, who doesn't like a Guinness now and then, right? So I thought I'd watch it, and I did. And man, I mean, I don't know what percentage of that show is actually accurate. And it got me to thinking, a lot of it isn't accurate. A lot of it is not accurate at all. And while the family, in certain parts, based on a book written by one of the granddaughters in the family, has, kind of perpetuated this series of the House of Guinness, which I guess they intend to go all the way to the 1960s with for some reason. And they just make it up as they go along. It's sort of based on things that happened, but they have to make it more interesting, I think, as what they think. And unfortunately, I think that there are a lot of people that are going to watch the show, and it is well acted, and it is well written, and it is really gay. There's no other way to put it. They said it's like there was a cowbell skit somewhere in the Netflix writers' room, and they said, "I've got a fever, and the only thing that is going to cure this series is more gay." So they had to make Sir Arthur Guinness, homosexual, and that runs through the entire series, and it was because he and his wife never had children. And most histories of the family will say, yeah, they were incredibly boring, and they didn't have children. And but today's understanding of that means that you know what he was. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have, I guess, in modern films or whatever these series are. You have to have sex, and you have to have intrigue, and you have to have all this, and there's intrigue and sex. People are human beings, so we don't really maybe know for sure that those things didn't happen. But I think that the risk that it is presented as a history, as a fictionalized history, they say at the beginning, as if to wipe away anything that is completely inaccurate, which I would say is probably about 70% of the show. They just invented characters like you have to do, and a lot of other shows do that. So we're going to talk about that today. Because I'm not an expert historian, but I just take umbrage with some of these issues, and I feel like I guess you can see it. You should. I mean, I think it's an interesting show, and it's well acted, like I said. But I mean, it's just why do we do this? Because this is our modern sensibility, that we just have to have these storylines woven into every single story of the past to make it seem even more of a normative situation. I think that's really the goal. And I don't know if history is as pliable as people, in particularly writers of narratives and fictionalized stories of all types, end up making it. When you leave the past to historians, like I said, it's stiff and unyielding and inconvenient, actually, sometimes to read. And there's footnotes in the Chicago style, and maybe you read those, maybe you don't. But when history, when the past is passed on to storytellers, not historians, it becomes a lot more pliable. It becomes something, I think, that you can sit in without splinters, if you want to look at it like that way. This, I suppose, is part of the problem. We've become so fond of comfortable history that we no longer recognize when it has been padded for our modern behinds. In the house I grew up in, we had some photos in our our photo books, maybe some hanging on the walls or whatnot. This was long before history came to us through Netflix or classroom projects dreamed up as gospel. There was lots of black and white portraits of grandparents and great grandparents, and I had a great grandfather who was in World War II, and he kind of looked like, at least in that picture, I didn't see a lot of pictures other than that of him, so I don't really know. I'm sure he laughed, but it looks like he had been born just to frown sometimes. So my mom used to say that he was in World War I, and I can tell, as being an Army veteran, that looked like the uniform that they wore in World War I. And I've done the family history and the lineage to some degree and found his draft card, and sure, by golly, he was in World War I. But stories, if they're told by family, can become pliable, and sometimes something that you're used to hearing in a comfortable way removes splinters. So we don't know necessarily if everything is accurate or not, even when we hear them in our own house. And I'm not denying any stories that I heard about any relatives. I just know that most people have families and photographs of their relatives of bygone eras, and maybe there are stories about their exploits and the things that they did. And usually, particularly when it comes to our own family, they're usually, heroic, to some degree, because we like to remember our ancestors, in that way. But we may never know exactly what any of them actually did, particularly generations that are, so much older than us and long gone. So, sometimes we say things like, well, he fought bravely, or he did this, or whatever it happens to be. And in retrospect, that's the kind of answer that, it means nothing, but it also means everything. It means everything to the person hearing it and who is a part of that family. And at the same time, it's really not very descriptive. Fighting bravely is maybe not what we might have different definitions of what that might mean. And what if he had, worked in, I didn't know. I don't know my great grandpa Miners is who I'm talking about. I don't know if he fought bravely in World War I. I assume that he did. He could have run a supply tent. That could have been the case too. It wouldn't matter to me. I'm glad that he served, and he served his country wherever it happened to be. So I have more work to do on that. But it is an example, I guess, of where I'm going with this. It's like we all have relatives. I have many, many relatives, but he just happened to be fresh in my mind. I was looking through some stuff and I saw that picture, and he was standing there in his uniform, and he looked very, very handsome and serious, as as you would as a world war is pending, the first World War ever. So I assume that he fought bravely, but maybe he only fought bravely in the one way that actually mattered to generations like me, and that is, in the family imagination. And I don't know, and it doesn't matter, but it does. But it got me to thinking about, I was watching the House of Guinness and watching, thinking of my own family history and how we tell our stories, and do we fictionalize our own stories about our families to make ourselves feel better? And do we do that on a larger scale as a nation and as a culture? And I think it's almost natural, in fact, that we do that, because I think that's how myth and mythology works. It begins, maybe it's a lie, and it's a lie that's told out of love. or at least, out of the desire to make someone or something matter more than maybe they or it did. It becomes like a small private fiction that over time grows to fill entire countries. And so I know this from my own studies in history, that this is normal. When storytellers today, when they rewrite history to make it more palatable, or more relatable, or maybe more profitable, I understand that impulse, particularly as a storyteller myself. We want the past to have meaning, and we want that meaning to be relative, to us today, and in our perspective of what values are to today, and that is risky. Meaning is not the same thing as truth. And when we forget that distinction, we trade in our inheritance for a mirage, to some degree, I suppose. So in recent years, entertainment companies have discovered that history sells. It sells best, though, when it feels like it's therapy. And so when we talk about, for example, the Netflix series, The House of Guinness, it dresses up the already potentially sordid history of early, industrial era wealth, empire, issues that were happening between a divided Ireland, and it puts all that stuff and a lot more into fashionable garments that we like to see on TV. They make, they can get awards for that, for costumes, personal drama. We like moral redemption. We want to tie it all together somehow. And it isn't enough that the Guinness family, built truly an empire on beer and on class that they had, as Protestants in a divided Ireland. But so they were tied to the British Empire and all of that. And how did they try to weave it back together? And that's what the show tries to show. They must have also, according to the show, they must have also loved. They must have also suffered, and they must have triumphed in a way that flatters or our current modern sensibilities about empowerment and identity.
I, Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness, hereby give all my brewery concerns to my two sons, Edward and Arthur, jointly and equally.
We expected something more.
I feel it wise not to burden Benjamin and Anne with the temptations that come with fortune.
A gift from Mr. Guinness.
The children Sir Benjamin leaves behind are weak and divided. Now is the time to use that weakness.
The black flag of Guinness on American soil.
Rich men attract clever women. How do I look? This will be dangerous.
The chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and we have some weak links among us.
Love is our hope.
Walk away now, and you're gonna start a war.
Of course they did. Of course they loved, and of course they had sex. That's how we got here. That's how the current generation is here. And they did, have their sufferings and their moments, and but what they would consider, suffering, and what we would consider suffering, in the same shoes, I think would be shocking. They might have thought that this was mildly irritating, or they said, well, this is just the way life is, say like in the mid 1800s. Whereas if we were in that same situation today in our modern sensibilities and slopping around in the muck of the mid 19th century, I think we would be fragile, wilting flowers compared to them for sure. So they talk about, Arthur Guinness. He's the eldest son of 4 children. And he inherits everything from his father, who has the brewery. And so that includes the brewery and all the estates and all this other stuff. And Arthur Guinness himself, like I said, didn't have any children. He was married. And he's the one that they are, the Netflix writers are adamant that he was a homosexual. And family doesn't necessarily believe that at all. So, and I guess they're just okay with it. I guess maybe it sells more Guinness. I'm not sure. But anyway, he's been dead for 200 years. And so I got to imagine if he was watching, so 200 years be like, 18, not quite 200 years, 150 maybe, yeah, somewhere in there. I mean, it's been a while. It's been dead for a while. Let's call it 125. I don't know when he died. 1901? Somewhere in there? 1910? Yeah, so not quite 200 years. Anyway, can imagine him watch, but his, there are many Arthur Guinnesses. So before him, there certainly were Arthur Guinnesses that have been dead for 200 years. Anyway, imagine any one of those Arthur Guinnesses watching from the afterlife, if they could do that. And I got to imagine they'd be mildly confused about how they're being portrayed. In the show, his life, Arthur Guinness, which was, complex enough on its own, is now kind of rearranged to make a neat morality play about patriarchy and redemption and, figuring out who he is. And that's all fine. And it's a human tendency for men to go through that, particularly a man that really didn't have any real responsibilities and spent a lot of time, in London getting an education and all of that stuff. And then suddenly, having this put upon him. So the show, I think, does, it's interesting how that develops, particularly, with his brother Edward, and who is really kind of running the show running Guinness, the brewery, on the show anyway, and his sister's role, and then the youngest brother, who is an alcoholic, but they just come up to accept that he is an alcoholic and everything's fine and whatever. You can watch it. It's interesting, and it's believable, but it's turned into this. It's its own thing, and it's not history. I think in one episode, it's like watching, it's like you watch these episodes with the grim fascination of watching a man rearrange his own family tree. Because that's what's happening. They're just rearranging. They're actually taking stories from previous generations of the Guinness family and inserting them into this one window of time with these 4 siblings. But so she's not a fictional daughter. She's a real daughter. But in this fiction, she delivers a fictional speech of rousing, she's a strong feminist woman. And it would be a great TED Talk today. And that makes for stirring television, but it's also utter nonsense. But the viewer, who has no reason to know the differences, comes away believing that Arthur Guinness was not merely a brewer, but he was also part of a progressive, visionary family centuries ahead of his time and everybody else's. And I don't think that's accurate. What's the harm, you might ask? Well, it's just a little anachronistic uplift, isn't it? What's no big deal. Isn't it good that young women, for example, can see themselves in history, even if we have to, carve them into that narrative with a modern chisel of our own making? Well, the harm lies, I think, not in the intention, but in the effect. When we fictionalize history to soothe the conscience of the present, we rob both eras of their integrity. The past becomes a stage for our own moral performance, whatever we want it to be. And when we're no longer learning from it, we're just slapping ourselves on the back, congratulating ourselves all the way through it, how good we are and how amazing we are. And this is how things, and we can have historical characters through fictional works make observations that justify our modern premises. That's the great thing about being a screenplay writer, or I suppose a writer of certain types of fiction. Anyway, you can have them say whatever you want them to say, and it just helps tell the story, and it makes your listener or your viewer feel good about their own position in life. one of my favorite authors who did great works in fiction, in my opinion, and I think one of the best, maybe perhaps the best book of fiction that I've ever read, as I've said before, is A Prayer for Owen Meany. So I'm talking about John Irving. John Irving might have said, or at least he implied in his novels, that people are rarely wicked on purpose. They're simply, self-interested. And self-interest has an exquisite talent for disguising itself as virtue. So it goes with our revisionist age. We rewrite history, not to deceive, but to feel better. We want to feel better about our ancestors, and we want to feel better about ourselves. But the result is still a deception. It's deception all the same. And it's not just dramatists, like in the case of the House of Guinness, that fall into this trap. The journalist, obviously, can become a myth maker. And I think that is something that is fairly evident and obvious if you've been paying attention for the last, couple of decades. When the 1619 project, for example, when that emerged, it was heralded as a necessary corrective, a rewriting of the American story to center the experience of slavery. And truly, it was ambitious, poetic in some parts, and in many places, deeply moving. But, poetry has its dangers when it masquerades as history. They're two different things. and some of our history, our understanding of history, including, for example, Paul Revere's Midnight Run, that's from poetry. I think that's a Longfellow poem, to be honest with you. It's poetry. It's not fact. Paul Revere did make a midnight run, and we know about those things, but the things that were said and the experiences that we're used to, that's between poetry and Disney. We have come to this, crystallization of fiction, or a fictionalized version of history in our minds as the truth. The 1619 Project made sweeping claims that the United States, for example, was not founded in liberty, but in bondage, that the revolution itself was fought to preserve slavery. Okay. Now, these claims were and have been, and to some degree, it's faded away now, but they were fiercely debated by historians. And I think the true historians won out in that deal, who pointed out that the truth was, as ever, far more complicated than what Nikole Hannah-Jones had come up with. And even she herself admitted that it was, not really history, but more of an opportunity perhaps to schedule or open the door to a debate.
We are a collective people, that we have had to be a collective people. And sometimes when we find success, we lose that sense of obligation to community. And I know the uniform I'm supposed to wear, I know the dialect that I'm supposed to speak in, and I know what I was told about the type of journalism I should do if I wanted to be successful. Right. But to me, success is not worth it if you sell yourself out to get it.
Yet the debate really didn't matter. And it didn't matter. It mattered very little to those who just felt that the story was true. And that's the danger that I'm trying to get at. That feeling, which is powerful and cathartic in some ways to some people, and righteous to a lot of people, became a kind of belief. That's the trouble with myth making. Once it gives emotional satisfaction, it becomes immune to evidence. Isn't that nice? Wouldn't you like to be a criminal that was immune to evidence? Now, I remember we have many teachers in one's past, and one of the teachers was a pretty good smoker. Smoked, I wouldn't say incessantly. Clearly, they had to take breaks to teach. But you could definitely smell his lessons maybe on your clothes the next day. Once he made the comment that history is what the winners write. You've ever heard that before? The winners write the history. And he thought, I suppose, like a lot of people, pretty clever for saying that. Winners write the history, or history is what the winners write. And I think now in retrospect, he was only about half right. History is also what the storytellers write. And I guess in this particular subject matter of the day, I'd say the storytellers are often more dangerous than the winners who write the history. The winner wants to be remembered as victorious, but I think that the storyteller just wants to be believed. When the 1619 Project became a curriculum in schools, it ceased to be a literary interpretation, and it became like a catechism. Children learned that America was born in sin, which is not untrue, but they learned it as if that sin were the only story, which is not the same thing at all. It's like the, my relative or your relative's valorous supply tent, for example, potentially. It's a story that replaces one kind of simplification with another. And while a simplification may be morally satisfying, it's never intellectually honest. So, for John Irving's characters, you'll recall, if you've read it, rarely settle for simple answers because they live with contradiction, the kind that, gnaws at the moral nerves. So if we wish to teach history with integrity, we have to live with that same kind of discomfort with the characters of which we're discussing. The past is not a sermon that we can affirm our virtue over others. I think it's just a mirror to expose, if nothing else, human complexity. So, of course, another kind of fictionalization, the one that's cloaked in reverence, is no less hazardous than the other two I've mentioned already. The Chosen, the popular series produced by Angel Studios, that takes the Gospels and expands them into a cinematic universe, giving the backstories, the personality quirks, and modern emotional arcs to the apostles and the characters around the apostles that are mentioned in the Bible, and many who are not. It's beautifully acted and lovingly made. We enjoyed the seasons. We enjoyed watching the show. We appreciated the message because it is, the Bible from the Bible. And we recognize that it has been fictionalized. Because it has. I mean, the Bible doesn't give you a screenplay. No matter who writes it, you have to, they fill in the blanks, and so they did. But that's how you tell a story in that type of scenario. But the problem, obviously, it can be, and I think that they are aware of it. It can be profoundly manipulative, even in its sincerity. So if you watched The Chosen, as I did, maybe you start to believe that this is how Jesus really talked.
Are you fast? Do you look impressive when you walk? Maybe not. But these are things the Father doesn't care about. When you pass from this earth and you meet your Father in heaven, where Isaiah promises you will leap like a deer, your reward will be great. So hold on a little longer. And when you discover yourself finding true strength because of your weakness, and when you do great things in my name, in spite of this, the impact will last for generations.
Maybe this is how Matthew really struggled. Maybe that's how Mary really cried or wept. The series The Chosen doesn't merely illustrate the Gospels, it kind of colonizes them. It fills those silent spaces of the Scripture with new dialogue, and the dialogue is good, but it's so confident that it possesses the ability to erase the boundary between imagination, maybe, and revelation. So I really don't have any quarrel, with what The Chosen is trying to do, and it represents, my faith of Christianity. John Irving himself wrote a lot about spiritual doubt with great tenderness. But the danger of The Chosen, to some degree, is not its piety or their good intentions. It is its precision, or maybe, imprecision, precision by imprecision, if that makes sense. The words are precise, what they're saying, but they're not necessarily, or they aren't the precise words in the gospel. So, by portraying invented moments, like they do in The Chosen, the different seasons that they have, with such emotional clarity, the show potentially can harden their fiction, their storytelling, into a person's memory. And so a generation that's raised on streaming platforms will, or could, remember, this Jesus, the one with, perfect cinematic lighting and digestible compassion and a cool accent and more. They might remember, this Jesus in The Chosen more vividly than the textual Jesus Christ of the Gospels. And that can be, I'm sure that can be challenging for, the actor. he's boy, talk about being typecast. And so I guess that's how myth overtakes scripture, doesn't it? Just as it overtakes history. We start, telling stories and filling in the blanks in all cases. And I think that's fine in normal conversation. I think that's, I do that, we can extrapolate that. Even on this show, in the first season, we did first season, maybe the second season, we did a take on numbers where Moses had to, go up and make more rules. And so he'd say, wait a second. Then you'd hear him run off, and he'd go up, and then you'd hear the thunder, and then you'd hear steps running back down, and then he'd say, okay, here's what we're going to do. That's, I don't know if it's okay to make humorous comments about that Old Testament or not, but I did. And so I think in small conversation, that's fine. But I was never presenting that as actually what happened. It is a take on what occurred. And I would think that my careful listener, can think critically and realize that even in those cases that we're not, we're filling things in. That's what we're going to get to, is the critical thinking aspect of this whole thing. If you allow myth to overtake history, the audience, whoever it is, emotionally becomes disarmed, and then they accept the invention as truth, intimate truth. The fiction, if it's told enough, and if it's told well enough, beautifully enough, it becomes, I think, a lot of times indistinguishable from fact. It's not a new danger. I've already said, Longfellow's poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. I think that's Longfellow. Anyway, the church once painted frescoes for the same purpose. Frescoes, where they're portraying, visually portraying scenes from the Bible, and to make that belief, that story that is actually in the scriptures more visible. But a thing about the frescoes is that they never claimed to be documentaries. And while there might have been the same, illiterate people looking at the frescoes and saying, yes, that there is, that's Andrew, or that's Jesus, I don't think that they may have thought that is what Jesus looked like. And the same problem, just different technology today. I'm not sure. But it didn't claim to be a documentary. It was just saying this is it was our artistic impression of a biblical story. Maybe that's what The Chosen is trying to do. However, The Chosen does kind of, I don't know, claim to be more of a documentary than it probably ought to. It says, here's the truth behind the verses. And they want people to feel it. And I get it, and I understand that. So I'm not beating up on The Chosen. I'm more concerned about the risk to the uncritical thinking viewer. And when it, in fact, what we're talking about is, presentation that's in a lot of ways speculation dressed up with some empathy. And whether it's The Chosen or the 1619 Project or the House of Guinness, there is a particular kind of viewer, let's call him the casual one, who watches a dramatized history like the House of Guinness, not for education, but for entertainment. I mean, there's a nudity. He sits down after work, there's dinner on his lap, and he lets the story wash over him. And he may not even realize he's absorbing information. He just knows that he likes feeling informed without being bored. In other words, being able to talk about something historical in an entertaining way. The viewer is good-hearted, let's say this casual one, but unguarded. And that is the one I think that is at most at risk, whether it's a viewer or a reader. He doesn't cross-check the speech, for example, that the Guinness daughter gives, or cross-check that Arthur Guinness was probably not homosexual. It doesn't do any of that with any historical record. Doesn't crack the Bible open while watching The Chosen. He doesn't compare the 1619 project claims with academic consensus, because that's boring. And he doesn't question whether Jesus would actually wink in the marketplace. He just trusts the storyteller, and he believes, like a lot of us do, what the fiction says, because the fiction feels, this isn't a word, but I'm going to say it, realer, more real than history ever did in school. We just memorize dates and, blah, blah, blah. And so once that trust is given to the show or the author or whatever, boy, it's just nearly impossible to get that back. Can't revoke it. So I think of a friend of mine, let's say just a nice guy who rarely reads, but man, he loves documentaries and historical dramas. And he told me once that he learned more from The Crown than from any history class. When I mentioned that a lot of the scenes in The Crown were entirely invented, he was just genuinely surprised. He's like, but it's about the royal family. They wouldn't just make it up, he said. Well, they make up a lot of it. That, I guess that right there that's the quiet corrosion of truth that history can provide, but it's corroded by fiction and poetry. That doesn't mean that fiction and poetry are bad, but you have to know the difference between them. It doesn't happen through propaganda. There's plenty of that already in the world, or censorship, also way too much of censorship, but it happens through narrative convenience. It's just a good story to hear or see. The lie is not told maliciously to us, but it's just told efficiently, and we absorb it like crazy. And because it is entertaining, it just gets unnoticed, slips right by us. John Irving would have seen that irony, I think, as a writer, how people, the irony of how people can be undone, not by tragedy, but by sentimentality. We sentimentalize history the way we sentimentalize lost love. We just cut out the discomfort. But the discomfort is the truth. That's the part that is the truth. Without it, we're left with just a caricature of the past, smiling at us falsely from the television screen or the book or the magazine or your screen in your hand. There is, however, an argument that's worth hearing, that art must be free to interpret the past, to dramatize and invent, because imagination, that's how we connect with those who came before us. And there's some truth in that. Yeah. A perfectly factual history might be accurate, but it wouldn't be very alive. And we need our stories to animate the bones of the past, partly just so we want to continue to hear about it. But the difference between animation and distortion lies in the intention. So when Dickens wrote A Tale of Two Cities, he used fiction to reveal the emotional truth, for example, of revolution. He didn't claim that his story replaced the history books. He trusted that his readers would know the difference. However, today, that trust is largely gone. We no longer believe that the audience can distinguish between invention and documentation. So We just don't even bother marking the line anymore. And that's kind of scary. It's kind of paternalistic. The storyteller now becomes the moral babysitter. And it's as dangerous as it is condescending. When the House of Guinness adds a proto-feminist subplot or a homosexual subplot or a alternate lover to Sir Arthur's wife subplot or a Finian lover to Edward or any of these other things that they just completely made up lock, stock, and barrel. When they do that, it isn't trusting the viewer to appreciate history's sexism or history's romantic relationships or history's marriages, the way things were, and the struggles that were represented by both class and religions, Protestant, Catholic, all kinds of crazy things. They just kind of don't. I don't know. It's editing the past to flatter the viewer's present day version of morality. And I would argue that the writers of the Netflix House of Guinness, I'm not sure what their basis of morality is. When the 1619 Project converts poetic metaphor into an academic curriculum for schools, it assumes that the students cannot love a complex story anymore. It's just got to be this, that, or the other thing. Only a righteous one will motivate students to consider these things in our history. And when the Chosen, scripts Christ with, modern psychology, I guess it might assume that faith cannot survive ambiguity, which is the whole reason that we need faith in the first place. It's the ambiguity of life. Mystery. But ambiguity is the marrow, right? It's the marrow of both faith and history. If you take away ambiguity, if you strip it away, you're left with something smooth and digestible, I suppose, but not really true. So perhaps the real problem, I think, lies not with storytellers, but you and me, us. It's us. It's us, the audience, that we demand that every story reflects our current values. I don't share the values of the writers of the House of Guinness. But there's apparently a lot of people who really want them values to be pressed upon the rest of us. Or maybe they are, and I'm just an old-fashioned, out-of-touch guy. We are, after all, a generation that is pretty allergic to discomfort, and we don't want to make anybody uncomfortable in any way. They didn't seem to have that problem as much in the mid-19th century. Today, we cannot tolerate that our heroes were flawed, that they were not perfect, that some of them were slave owners. We just can't imagine it. It's impossible. Can't believe that any of our ancestors believed things that we now think is abhorrent. It's impossible. It's how weak-minded are we today? And so tied into our weak little bubble of understanding. So we ask the past to apologize to us. We want the past to apologize to us. Of course, they're all dead and gone. There's no apologies. They're not apologizing for anything. You couldn't split wood next to these people, but we can make them apologize to us through our art. We make it perform virtue retroactively for our entertainment. In John Irving's world, characters, they're never allowed to be comfortable in their own righteousness, which is a cool thing about reading John Irving. They are instead forced to confront the absurdity of human contradiction. Say, like the orphan who becomes a doctor, who then delivers abortions. The tiny boy who believes himself an instrument of God in the case of Owen Meany. And in that spirit, we might say that history, too, is an orphan, unwanted by the present, unless it can perform something useful to our modern needs. We prefer the chosen past the curated, edited, dramatized, well-lit version that flatters our worldview today, but choosing comfort over truth, you and I become like the characters in Irving's novels who learn, and usually too late that they learn, that safety is a pretty poor substitute for honesty. When we fictionalize history to fit our moral fashions, we lose three things. We lose perspective, we lose humility, and I think we lose curiosity. Our perspective vanishes because we impose our modern lens on every event, judging the dead by standards they didn't even know about. Humility disappears because we start to think of ourselves as actually being morally superior to every single age that has come before us. How lucky are we? And curiosity dies, or can die, because we already know what we want the story to say. We just need to bend the facts a little bit until they actually say it. In this way, fictionalized history becomes a mirror, not a window. We look into it and we see, well, we only see ourselves or our causes, our certainties, our virtue, not theirs. The past becomes just another backdrop for a selfie. And that, perhaps, I think, is the most dangerous illusion of all, that the story was always about us. And that is today, isn't it? It's all about us. And that's a problematic illusion for any of us to have, particularly about, well, anything, honestly, but history. That's the subject of this conversation today. Well, the remedy, folks, how do you get out of this? It's not censorship. It's just honesty. I love honesty. And, let the storytellers tell their stories because they are entertaining. And I do like historical fiction. I like those kind of movies. I find it interesting. But we all have to admit what they are. You put a disclaimer at the start of every dramatized history. This is not the truth. It is our attempt at understanding it. And I think they could go even further than that, because at the House of Guinness, they go, this is a fictionalized character history based on real characters. That's how they get away. I think they need to go maybe a full paragraph, and it's like, we made up everything in these categories. This is all untrue, but we thought you would like it better. And then decide, does the audience really like the addition of more gay cowbell, for example? Maybe half the audience does. I don't know. I don't know what it is. But maybe it'll encourage the viewer to ask, not how does this make me feel? How does it make me feel about this? But hopefully it makes us ask, how do I know this is true? And that's what got me started on this whole thing today. Like, that is critical thinking. Let's call it skepticism or whatever, but critical thinking is, how do you know what you know? How do you know that that is true? Just because someone is telling you something, you should not assume that they're telling you the truth. And it doesn't, and particularly if it's, a world leader, any nation, you should be skeptical, and you should be critical and thinking critically of how you know what you know, and expecting them to be able to elaborate conclusively, if not convincingly, how they know what they know. That's critical thinking. Can't just accept that what you're telling me is true. You're going to have to tell me how you know that is. Now, if we're in conversation together, we're standing side by side, and you're telling me something, that doesn't mean that I'm going to question you. I might just nod my head and laugh and go on. And then I might, I'm probably thinking, I don't think that's true. because either I don't want to get in it with you, or I will occasionally just say, I don't know if that's true. How do you know that's true? Where'd you hear that from? Well, and then you become like Tommy Boy, or not Tommy Boy, you become like Chris Farley and Billy Madison.
That Veronica Vaughn is one piece of ace. I know from experience, dude. You know what I mean?
No, you don't.
Well, not me personally, but a guy I know. Him and her got it on. Woo-wee!
No, they didn't.
No, they didn't. But you can imagine what it'd be like if they did, right? Huh?
You can learn critical thinking by watching Chris Farley movies and Adam Sandler? Yes. Because they don't pretend to be anything but funny fiction. All right. We can teach this critical thinking thing. It isn't cynical to teach critical thinking. It isn't cynicism to be a critical thinker. It's a reverence for truth. That's how I look at it. It's a reverence for context. It's a reverence for the beautiful imperfection of real people in real situations in real times throughout the world's history. People made in God's image who were utterly and eternally imperfect without their Savior. So I don't know about my, great-grandfather. I don't know what he did in World War I. Doesn't really matter. I'm sure he did fight bravely, whatever it was that he did. In his way, he served bravely, as my dad did, as my grandpa did, as my other relatives have. I don't know all of their stories. I don't know everything they went through. I don't know everything that I went through and things that I've done. I mean, I didn't do that much. But there are stories, and I could fictionalize the heck out of them. I can be proud of my service, for example, but I'm not making up any war stories. At least try not to. Well, whatever your story is, and maybe you've got some like that, or a relative or a family story. Maybe it's unembellished. Maybe it's not cinematic like they've made the Guinness story, whatever it happens to be. Maybe there are no grand speeches. Maybe there's no redemption arc that is obvious from one point to the other. But it's still a story, and it should still be true without those, grand appurtenances. And in that truth, I think that my relatives, my grandfather, my dad, my great-grandparent, all these things, that they're more of a hero than any fictional one I could invent. That's the lesson, I think, that we keep fighting for. In education, in conversation, it's just the truth. However plain, that's always more sacred than the story that flatters it or steers it one way or the other. I don't know if a person not smiling in an old photograph of black and white from 100 years ago is evidence of unhappiness. Maybe it's just a glimpse of a moment. And maybe as I've been going through hundreds of photographs, particularly this week as we prepare for my father-in-law's celebration of life, a good wake, putting together the video for that, the videos, I should say. There's a lot of stories behind them. That's just one teeny tiny snippet that we can look at. And he was a great storyteller, so it's going to be hard to replace them with better ones. But I think we just maybe that's what all this is about. It's just a whole bunch of things of me, working on these things for the family, and also, occasionally catching lunch and watching an episode or whatever of the House of Guinness or or thinking about these other things and just wrapping it all up and saying, hey, this, the truth is complicated and the truth is wonderful and the truth is ambiguous, and therein lies our faith in the master creator. That's my perspective, I guess, if that makes any sense. Maybe it's why I find it hard to enjoy the latest historical series on Netflix, no matter how finely shot or righteously written they are, or maybe not so righteous. There are ghosts behind those characters. They were the real people. And because of the fictionalization and the broadcast specialty of modern movie making, they've been stripped of their contradictions, or they've had entirely new unnecessary contradictions added so that we could make room for our own perception of values and, I don't know, our own contradictions maybe. It's not that I resent storytellers. I don't. I think of myself to some degree as a storyteller myself. I like storytellers. Like I said, I appreciate very much and enjoy John Irving. And I love watching movies. I envy storytellers in a way for their ability to make the past so luminous, exciting to watch. But I wish that they would learn to leave just a little more darkness in the corners and just enough for the ghost to breathe. You don't have to besmirch their character. And I consider some of those things that I've talked about besmirching elements of character that are completely unnecessary. History, like faith, is not a thing that is going to be perfected. It is a thing that you wrestle with. It's healthy to, I think, doubt, to investigate, and live alongside as part of your day-to-day life. When we turn history or faith into entertainment, I think we risk losing the very uneasiness that makes it worth remembering in the first place. So yeah, I guess there's a moral to this, a sunny side to the story, if there is one. Irving would insist that there always is. Well, I guess it might be this. So, tell the story. Absolutely, yes. Tell the story. But tell it knowing it's only a story. The truth, I think, will thank you for the distinction. Have a great week, my friends. Go out and do great things. And as always, try to be the sunny side of someone else's life.
When the shadows fall and doubts begin to creep, remember together we're strong, never weak. Lift your neighbor up with kindness every day. Let your actions speak the words you want to say.
The Sunnyside of Life is a weekly production about our life on the family farmstead here in Iowa, the liberties we prize, and the pursuits which make us happy. None of this is possible, of course, without Christ in our lives. For the Lord God is our sun and our shield. He gives us grace and glory.
Be the sunny side of someone else's life. Share your light and joy through struggle and strife. Keep your heart open and your soul always bright. Together we will share this sunny side life. Be the sunny side of someone else's life. Share your light and joy through struggle and strife. Keep your heart open and your soul always bright. Together we will share this sunny side life.
May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may the sunny side of your life in Christ be made evident unto you each and every day, and give you peace.